Dear students, this third week we will be looking at the managerial function of organizing, and we'll start with chapter 10, which is on the basic elements of organizing. The learning objectives for this chapter will include an understanding of the building blocks in the construction of an organization. We'll also be looking at the alternative approaches to job designs, right? We'll be looking at also and familiarizing ourselves with the rationale for grouping jobs into departments and also the elements that are involved in reporting relationships. Further on the learning objectives, we will learn how authority is delegated within organizations. Also, we'll look at how the activities of an organization are coordinated across the departments of the organization and which positions within an organization or how positions within an organization are actually differentiated. The basic elements of organizing. Organizing has to deal with the decisions that are made on how best to group an organization's activities or how best to group the resources of an organization. And you find out that this managerial function of organizing can actually impact the competitiveness of an organization. And when we look at an organization structure, right, we've talked about organizational structure in the past, and we'll find out that in an organizational structure, it tells you the positions within an organization, it tells you the reporting relationships. So basically, here it says that this organizational structure would be the set of elements that can be used to configure an organization, right? It talks about the departments within an organization and the positions within those departments in an organization. And an organizational structure will basically provide information on the job designs. So, whichever jobs within departments or within business units of an organization, such organizational structure will provide details on the job design, right? And job design basically has to do with the determination of a person's or an employee's work related responsibility. What are the tasks involved in the person's role? That has to do with the job design, right? Now, when we talk about job groups being one other element of an organizational structure, job groups basically relates to what are the departments within an organization, what are the business units within an organization. In an organization like Francis Marion University, job groups will include the schools within the university or the colleges within the university. Like the School of Business would be a job group, right? The school of the College of Liberal Arts would be a job group as well. Now when we look at the other element of an organization structure, that would be reporting relationships, right? It's basically about the supervisor subordinate relationship, right? The manager subordinate relationships. That tells you who an employee of an organization reports to within the organization, right? What position or managerial title, right? Does the managerial title of the person or the title of the manager such an employee reports to? That will tell you the reporting relationships, right? Like in the School of Business, for instance, you find out that they well, in the School of Business, there aren't a lot of reporting lines because of how flat the structure in the School of Business is. And you can see that Francis Marion University also touts itself of having a flat organizational structure whereby there aren't a lot of reporting lines, there aren't a lot of manager subordinate reporting relationships. There are reduced managerial hierarchy within the Francis Marion University. So that is actually replicated in the School of Business, whereby unlike other colleges where there could be departmental chairs that report to the dean and the dean ultimately reporting to the provost, in the School of Business every faculty member basically reports to the dean. But to help the coordination of activities of the School of Business, one thing the dean does is to have department coordinators within the School of Business or unit coordinators within the School of Business. When I say unit coordinators, I mean units like the accounting unit, the finance unit, the management unit, the computer science unit, the management, the information systems is actually under the management unit, right? And you have the marketing unit. So we have unit coordinators, right, that report to the dean kind of, but that reporting relationship isn't fully established because of how flat the structure in the School of Business is, right? But that's just to tell you about reporting relationships. Like even in Francis Marion University, after the dean of the School of Business kind of reports to the provost, you find out that the provost ultimately reports to the president. Those tells you the reporting relationship. So in the provost president's report, or the president provost reporting relationship, the provost would be the subordinate and the president would be the manager or the supervisor. Now, looking at another structure element of the organizational structure, we'll look at authority, right? Authority has to deal with the power that has been legitimized by the organization. So the office of the dean speaks to the authority that is accorded the office of the dean because it is fully identified or rather legitimized by Francis Marion University, right? Now, looking at the other element, which is coordination of activities among jobs, this is the process of linking activities of various departments of an organization, right? How are the activities of all the colleges, all the schools in Francis Marion University, how do they contribute their quota towards delivering on the goals or objectives of Francis Marion University as a whole, right? Now, you talk about also the differentiation among positions within an organization. This has to do with what are the titles of the managers or what are the titles of the employees of an organization, right? When you say the dean, that differentiates the dean of the School of Business, for instance, from the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, for instance. So those titles, the nomenclature, or rather the titles, actually helps in the differentiation of employees of an organization or the differentiation among positions of an organization. Designing jobs. We said earlier on, job design is basically all about an individual's or an employee's work related responsibilities, right? So you find out that the starting point for designing jobs would be to determine the level of specialization or the desired specialization of that job function or of that job role, right? Whatever specialization that is required, right? So you find out that job specialization will be the degree to which the overall task of the organization is broken down and divided into smaller components. And job specialization basically emanated from the concept of division of labor, right? And you find out that it's just like in the School of Business. So the School of Business does not have all its specialties collapsed in one. Like we said earlier on, you find out that in the School of Business you have the accounting unit. The accounting, having that unit tells you the level of specialization too, based on the job designs within the School of Business. So in the accounting unit of the School of Business, for instance, you find out that the faculty members who are in the accounting unit are basically faculty members that have a terminal degree in accounting. So it speaks to the specialization of the members of faculty within that unit of the School of Business. That's why the job design here, it speaks to the specialization. That's why it's broken down. So the School of Business isn't like having a holistic view on what they are delivering as service or what they're delivering as learning services to students. They had to create some form of specializations, right? Given the level of expertise of the faculty members of the School of Business. That's why you have accounting faculty having terminal degrees in accounting, finance faculty having terminal degrees in finance, management faculty having terminal degree in management, and so on and so forth. Same with marketing faculty. That speaks to the specialization of those faculty members, and that infers on the job design, right? Which is factored into the units of the School of Business. Specialization. You find out that the specialization has to do with how narrowly defined jobs are, right? And it's easier if jobs are highly specialized because you can also have specialized equipment that help with delivery of the job. So specialization within organizations actually help with job delivery because both the equipments that are required for delivering on the job and the expertise with specialization, it helps for better efficiency. So you find out that the benefits of specialization would be the increased proficiency of the employees that take on those job roles that are specialized, right? And the transfer time between their tasks decreases because you find out that most employees that occupy those roles that are specialized, they are quite knowledgeable. So even or whatever tasks that are required of that job role or the that are required for that job function, you find out that there are similar tasks. So such an employee would be at ease in actually handling similar tasks. And we talked about the equipment and for capacity development of employees of an organization that take on roles when they are specialized roles, right? The training costs are relatively low rather than training employees of an organization on the overall functions of an organization. When they are narrowly defined, it saves cost for the organization, right? And you have the limitations as well, which would be boredom because the monotony of the tasks, the similarity of the tasks that are performed over and over again, it could lead to boredom and dissatisfaction of an employee, especially if the employee is someone who likes challenging tasks, who likes taking on new tasks, right? Having to take on repetitive tasks would actually get such employee to 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 be bored, if that makes sense. Also, it can lead to higher absenteeism and lower quality of work. So when someone does same thing over time, they feel they are pros and they could act as well as defer jobs that require some form of urgency, and you find out that most often than not they may choose not to come in because they'll be like, is it not the same thing I'm going into the office to do? So also lower quality of work when employees find out that the task is not challenging, they may not be as involved in those tasks, and that might actually impact the quality of the outcome, if that makes sense. Also, the anticipated benefits of specialization may not occur, right? The benefits of division of labor, that is the idea behind having job specialization within the organizing function, such benefits may not be realized, and that's a limitation, right? And managers actually should avoid extreme specialization because one reason for that would be that when people are highly specialized, let's say for instance in the School of Business, how specialized the School of Business is because of how the units are basically subdivided, right? You'll find out that, for instance, if in an organization like this, if capacity is built in such a way that someone in management can have the wherewithal or the capabilities to take on the functions or the roles of someone in finance, for instance, that would create for ease in trying to cushion for when there's vacancy in another unit of the School of Business. I don't know if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say here is when employees of an organization are broadly trained, then they can actually be redeployed effectively into other roles, right, that are not their primary roles. Meaning that when an employee that is undertaking on another role is unavoidably absent or unavoidably not at work, someone else in a different role entirely, because there isn't extreme specialization, because there may be incidences of job rotation whereby people are cross-trained, right? Someone else who has a different primary role could actually take on another person's responsibility if they have such expertise. That's why extreme specialization may not be encouraged. Alternatives to specialization. First will be job rotation. I mentioned that tangentially in the previous slide. And job rotation basically would be about moving employees from one job within an organization to another job, right? Having them to have a feel of that job role or that job function, to familiarize themselves with it, consciously or deliberately redeploying employees to gain some form of experience, to gain some of expertise in other roles, right? And you find out that job rotation provides for what we call functional flexibility. Functional flexibility was what I explained in the earlier slide, whereby if for some reason some employee is not at work, when you have functional flexibility, or when employees of a particular unit are not there entirely, let's say where I used to work in the industry, right? A whole unit may be off on training because it might be specialized, it might be a specialized training, but job rotation would allow for someone in another unit, because the person has an idea of delivery of tasks within another unit, right? The person can take on those roles when their colleagues are not at work for whatever reason. So job rotation actually allows for that functional flexibility, the flexibility whereby the functions of a job role do not suffer when an employee isn't there, because other employees who aren't in that job function can take on their job roles because they have such expertise, given given the job rotation within the organization, right? Being that they have been redeployed in those roles before and understand the requirements to deliver in those roles. Now, job enlargement will be about increasing the total number of tasks employees perform, right? And though positive consequences could happen given job enlargement, the training costs could increase, right? When you're increasing the responsibilities of a job role, of a job function of an employee, when you increase it, there's the likelihood that the responsibilities that are added to that function, the employee may require some form of training, some form of capacity development for them to have the relevant expertise to deliver on those new responsibilities that have been added onto their job roles. Does that make sense? And you find out that, so when those training costs increase, it might be a downside to the job enlargement, right? And when responsibilities of an employee are increased, if such an employee is in a unionized organization, right, where there's collective bargaining, given the increased tasks of that job function, they may actually argue, or the unions may actually argue for more pay for such an employee, or for such job position that is taking on more roles, right? And for instance, even when jobs have been enlarged to actually deter boredom because of the repetitiveness of tasks, right? When you're increasing the responsibility, adding new responsibilities over time, when they are repeated over time, but they become monotonous as well, and such an employee that have undertaken on new roles because they've done it repetitively, they could also get bored. Further on the alternatives to specialization, job enrichment. Job enrichment increases both the number of tasks and the control the worker has over the job. So you find out that job enrichment is kind of an advanced form of job enlargement, in the sense that for job enlargement, the tasks or the responsibilities of that job role is increased, right? But in job enrichment, beyond the increase in the task or the responsibilities of that employee's job role, right, there's equally some form of autonomy granted to the employee on how they approach the job. There is some form of less supervision, right? There's an increase in the employee's sense of responsibility because they are granted control over how they actually approach the job, right? So they become more responsible for the job outcomes, right? And you find out that the needed changes that are to be made for job enrichment to be successful are not always made, right? So you find out that in some cases, job enrichment might not produce the expected outcomes. How does that mean? So you find out that in most cases, it's required that before implementation, that the work systems of that organization, or work systems in that job group, or work systems in the department, right, group that the employee works, it should be analyzed, right? And this doesn't happen most often than not. And managers also should ask employees for their preferences, or for their responsibility, or for responsibilities of interest in trying to expand their job responsibilities. What do I mean by that? Meaning that when you're expanding the tasks of an employee's job role or job function, the ideal thing to do as a manager would be to do that in consultation with the employee. Try to know what areas of the organization or what areas of the job are of utmost interest to them, that they wouldn't mind taking on more responsibilities in that direction or in that work perspective, if that makes sense. That would actually lead to a successful implementation of job enrichment. Now, work teams allows an entire group to design the work system it will use to perform an interrelated set of tasks, right? So work teams would be like business units, departments, right? Departments basically come up with strategies or come up with approaches on how they will go about their jobs. Job characteristics approach. This approach to the design of jobs takes into account the work system in that organization or the work system in that group, job group or department, and also takes into account the preferences of the employee, right? It also takes into account the job roles or the responsibilities that are of interest to the employee. And it says that jobs can be diagnosed or improved along 5 dimensions. And those 5 dimensions would include, first, skill variety. Skill variety relates to the number of tasks or number of things or responsibilities that are undertaken by an employee, right, in the course of executing their job functions, right? So what a person actually does in a job would relate to their skill variety. How much task they take on, right, speaks to their skill variety. Now, task identity would be the extent to which the worker does a complete or identifiable portion of the total job, right? So a department of an organization, let's say School of Business in Francis Marion University, is saddled with the task of providing learning in relation to business, right? In providing business capacity development to students, right, of Francis Marion University. So task identity would have to do with, in School of Business, right, as a faculty member that I am, the portion of learning, business learning, that I provide in contribution to what the School of Business provides to her students or to the students of Francis Marion University will speak to task identity. So, for instance, I teach management classes and I teach human resource management classes, right? Those are some classes or courses that are just a portion of all the courses that are offered by the School of Business. So, undertaking those classes or having to teach classes in management and having to teach classes in human resource, which are not just the classes that are taught in the School of Business, having to do just that portion would relate to task identity, right? That speaks to the tasks that are undertaken by me as a faculty in the School of Business, right? Now, task significance will be the perceived importance of the task done by an employee, right? How important are those classes that I teach with regards to students obtaining a business degree from Francis Marion University or from the School of Business of Francis Marion University? For instance, the management class I teach is a core class, meaning it is a requirement, it's a prerequisite to taking other business classes. So you can find out that whatever portion of task I take on, especially with regards to teaching that management class, it is very, very important, given that most students in the School of Business cannot take other classes in the School of Business that will earn them a business degree if they don't take those management classes, which are basically core classes. So that speaks to task significance, right? What I do in that my role that has some form of relevance, right? Now, autonomy would be the degree of control an employee has over the work and how the work is performed, right? How they approach the job function or the job responsibilities, right? So when you find out that, for instance, non-exempt employees are accorded as much latitude or freedom to approach their jobs as the best way they can. For instance, in Francis Marion University, I'll be considered a non-exempt employee, right? And I'm allowed to actually approach the design of or the development of my syllables, the design of my classes, how I teach my classes. I'm allowed to go about it on the way I deem fit to a large extent, in as much as there are other specifications or basic guidelines on how things should be done within Francis Marion University. But to some extent, I am given some latitude of freedom on how I approach my classes. The dean of the School of Business, or maybe the management coordinator in the School of Business, does not micromanage me, in my job role. So that speaks to how much control I have on how I approach my teaching in Francis Marion University. That speaks to autonomy. Now, feedback is the extent to which the worker knows how well the job is being performed. That feedback, often than not, is provided after an appraisal of performance, right? After a manager has kind of evaluated how well the employee is doing their job or how well they've done their job. Based off that, feedback is provided. So in the School of Business, for instance, right, in my first year, I had, on every other year until I get tenure or what you may call job security, I have a supervisor or maybe the unit coordinator, right, the unit coordinator for management come and supervise how I teach a class once every year, right? He comes to evaluate my teaching in the classroom, and you find out also that coming for such evaluation, after the evaluation is done, feedback was provided to me, right? And subsequently, when such evaluations will be done, feedback also would be given to me. It tells me how well I did while teaching those classes for which I was appraised on, right? And also you find out that also there's some form of evaluation that comes at the end of each school year that is done by the dean, which was done for me as well, and feedback is provided to me based off that meeting or evaluation or appraisal meeting, telling me if I am on the right track with with the expectations of me by Francis Marion University or by the School of Business of Francis Marion University. So such feedback is to tell me if I am all getting the job done as is expected or not, right? And furthermore, there's something called growth needs strength. Growth needs strength, right? And growth needs strength affects how the model works. So what is growth needs strength all about, right? It says that people that are indicative of high growth need have a strong desire to grow, develop, and expand their capabilities and expected to respond strongly to these alternatives. So people with low growth need are expected not to respond as strongly as well, right? So that's about growth need strength. Now, all these 5 dimensions of job characteristics, right? When there are high ratings on these dimensions, there is high motivation for the employee that is given that job role. There's also the high likelihood for high quality performance, right? There's also the likelihood for high satisfaction for that employee and low absenteeism, as well as turnover or low turnover or less incidences of turnover when this job characteristics approach is being considered. This diagram on this slide is basically an illustration of the job characteristics approach we discussed in the earlier slide. Group jobs, departmentalization. Departmentalization is the process of grouping jobs based on some logical arrangements, right? So, and you find out that this logical arrangement or the rationale for grouping jobs most of the time is on the basis of the size of the organization, right? So, when organizations grow in size, meaning have more employees or have expanded departments, right? Or having more clients to serve, which will actually impact how much departments may be created or how much employees would have to actually meet the needs of their increased number of clients, right? The owner manager can no longer oversee all workers. Let's say the organization started as a one-man business, right? When they expand, when they're growing in size, like the number of employees is growing or their clientele is increasing and maybe they're expanding the number of departments, you find out that it grows from being one-man company or one-man business to being a bigger business, right? Because of the size. And new managerial positions would be instituted or established to oversee workers, right? Grouped to some logical plan, meaning that ab initio, maybe all employees of the organization reported to the owner founder, but when the organization increases in size, right, when you have more number of employees, it will be harder for one manager to oversee all those employees. So you find out that some form of logical arrangement, like putting them in departments or business units and having managers head those departments or head those business units or subdivisions, it allows for better reporting, right? It allows for better management rather than have just the owner manager oversee all employees, right? And now the logic in such a plan is the basis for all departmentalization, meaning that the basis could be on specialty or specialization. It could be the basis for such departmentalization, right? Like in Francis Marion University, for the School of Business, the logical basis for having the School of Business as a department is that in as much as Francis Marion University is to provide learning to people from the PD region and beyond, you find out that such learning is not modeled up in one. There's some form of logical arrangement for the kind of learnings that are provided to students or to the customers of Francis Marion University, right? Those kind of learnings, those logical arrangements allow for breaking down learning into business learning, liberal arts learning, health science learning, right? That's a logical arrangement. And having deans head those various departments, right, allows for better coordination within Francis Marion University. And like we said, there are 6 building blocks of organization. Job design would be the first building block, which we discussed already. Then departmentalization or job groups would be the second building block. Common basis for departmentalization. Functional departmentalization is all about grouping jobs by the same or similar activities, right? And you find that more in smaller organizations. So if the advantages would include that each department is staffed by experts in that functional area, right? And supervision is facilitated by, because an individual manager needs to just be familiar with only a narrowly defined set of skills, if that makes sense, right? And another advantage would be the ease in coordination of activities within departments. Now, you find out that with growth in the organization, right, disadvantages of functional departmentalization would include that decision making tends to become slower, right, and more bureaucratic, and employees may concentrate too narrowly on their own unit or their own department, thereby losing sight of the total organizational system. Product departmentalization. Product departmentalization groups the activities or functions of an organization by the products it offers or its product groups. And you find out that larger businesses like Apple, right, they adopt this form of departmentalization. And the advantages of this form of departmentalization would include that activities across products are integrated and coordinated, right? Since they are all for the same product type or product group. And there's ease or there's increased speed and effectiveness of decision making, right? When there's such product departmentalization. Also, the product performance is easily and objectively measured, right? Thereby improving the accountability of departments. There are also major disadvantages, which would include that the managers also may lose focus of the organization as a whole, right? And you find out that each department also needs its own functional specialists, thereby increasing the administrative costs for the organization. Customer departmentalization. Customer departmentalization groups the activities of an organization to respond to and interact with specific customers rather, or customer groups, right? And the advantage of such departmentalization is that the organization has the ability to use skill specialists to deal with unique customers, right? In the sense that one set of skills, like in the bank, for instance, let's say bank adopts most often than not adopts this customer departmentalization, right? One set of skills evaluates like business loans for customers, right? While another evaluates maybe car loans, while another may even evaluate, let's say, mortgage loans, right? So depending on the needs of the customer, there might be specific departments within a bank that actually addresses the needs or meets the needs of such customers, right? The uniqueness of the needs of each customer. Now, a fairly large administrative staff is required to integrate the activities of various departments for this type of departmentalization, right? Location departmentalization. Location departmentalization is about grouping jobs or the activities of an organization based on geographical location or based on geography, right? And you may find that more in multinational companies that are operational in different countries, right? And you find out that different countries, given their different law, that their variations in laws in this environment are varying customer needs, right? You will find out that such location departmentalization would be an advantage to organizations like multinational organizations because it allows them to respond quickly to the unique customer needs or environmental characteristics in those different countries that they operate. So having departments that are based off those locations, those departments can easily respond to the needs of their customers or the environmental needs, the external environmental needs in those environments, based off that those departments are charged by those organizations to respond to their needs where they are operational. So that would be an advantage for location departmentalization, right? And you can see still in that vein, an example would be like a company like Unilever, right, that produces, like, let's say, the Dove soap. In Nigeria, because their customers would appreciate reduced prices for their product or for the quality of product that they offer, you find out that the tablet Dove soap in Nigeria usually comes in very small sizes compared to the sizes that are provided to the US customers, right? That are bigger in size because they are not about reducing the cost, or they are not about reducing the sizes because the customers want reduced costs, right? Now, a primary disadvantage of having the location departmentalization would be, given the various locations where this organization exists or an organization exists, having several locations, right? They would need a large number of administrative staff to keep track of the activities of the various departments that are existent in those locations, if that makes sense, right? Now, there are other forms of departmentalizations beyond the ones we already discussed in details, and those would include the time departmentalization or sequence departmentalization, right? And you find out that some companies or some organizations actually group their activities based on time. And one of such organizations would be the airline companies, right? Because airline companies have different time slots for their flights, right? And you find out that somehow they may actually deploy their employees based off those time slots that their airplanes fly, right? Having the same number of employees or the same expertise, the same number of employees with their varying expertise that are required to ensure that the operation in that time frame is carried out effectively. So airlines may operate or may have such time departmentalization, right? And the sequence departmentalization, you may also find that in insurance companies, for instance, because you find out that insurance claim divisions are frequently organized by policy number sequence, right? There's the policy number sequence for which different departments or the services that are provided by insurance companies are based off, right? So they are based off the sequence of those policy numbers. That may be regarded as sequence departmentalization. So the diagram on this slide basically incorporates our discussions on the different types of departmentalization, right? So you see at the first level, just below the president, you will see the computers and software. That may be more aligned to the product departmentalization. Let's say, for instance, a company like Apple may have the products that are computer products, right? And they may have software products as well, right? So they could actually group their jobs or actually departmentalize based off these different products, right? Now you have at the third level where you have the manufacturing, finance, and marketing. You will see that that would relate more to functional departmentalization, right? Relating to the expertise of the employees within those departments, right? People in the marketing would have marketing expertise, whereas people in the finance, employees in the finance department have finance background, right? And you will see on the fourth level where you have like the Dallas, Phoenix, Chicago, St. Louis, that would be like location departmentalization, if that makes sense, right? So you can see that those are locations, different locations where the organization may be existent, right? And they could departmentalize based on that. Now, at the fifth level, where you have the industrial sales, consumer sales, that would probably be more aligned to customer departmentalization, right? Given the difference, the variation in sales, it might be likened more to the variation or the uniqueness of their customers. And further down, the last level on that diagram would be about where you have the Northwest US, Southwest US, all those locations in the US. That would equally speak to location departmentalization, but in this case it will be location departmentalization for maybe an organization that is not multinational in nature, right? This might be an organization that is existent within the US but in different locations in the US, but they probably base their activities or group their job functions based off the different locations within the US. Considerations of job groupings. There are synonyms or words that are similar in meaning to the word department, and some of these words would include divisions, units, sections, or bureaus. Like you must have heard me use the word business unit, right? That would also be a word that is similar in meaning to department. Other words that are not contained here but are similar to department, and I don't know, you may have heard me use it before now, would be functions, right? Departments may also be considered functions, job functions of an organization, right? What are the various jobs done in different sections of an organization? That may also be regarded as a department, job functions or functions. Or structures, right? Talking about organizational structure, all those composite structures that actually form an organization, those composite structures are departments. So departments may also be called or seen as structures, right? Now, any organization may employ multiple bases of departmentalization, right? Meaning an organization may have both the functional departmentalization and customer departmentalization at the same time within the same organization. I mean, it's not specific to these two I mentioned. It just means that it could be two or more of the departmentalization that we discussed. Those two or more of those departmentalizations may be existent in one organization. So you may see an organization that has both the functional departmentalization and maybe the location departmentalization if they are a multinational company, for instance. So meaning that you wouldn't expect all the time to see only one form of departmentalization within an organization, right? Now, the role of social media also is beginning to impact departmentalization, right? How would you consider that? Meaning that, for instance, you find out that in an organization, the organization I used to work for in the industry, with the advent of social media, departments like public affairs department, right, in the organization I used to work for, now had to create a media relations unit, a subdivision within that department, right? That media relations, right, would have to incorporate even all forms of media, including the social media. So they had to actually create a function or a subdivision within the Department of Public Affairs to actually oversee or take on the responsibilities or tasks that relate to media or even social media, right? So you find out that advent of social media is actually equally impacting departmentalization within organizations. Chain of command. So this would be the third element or the third building block of an organization, right? We talked about the job design, the job group, now chain of command, or what you call the authority, right? The line of authority or the chain of command. This basically is about the reporting relationships among positions within an organization, right? So a chain of command relates to a clear and distinct line of authority among the positions in an organization. Line of authority meaning the manager subordinate relationship or supervisor subordinate relationship. So line of authority, one overseeing one function or position overseeing the other function that actually reports to it. That would relate to the chain of command within the organization, right? And it's composed of two elements, right? One would be what's called the unity of command. The unity of command concept basically suggests that each person within an organization must have a clear reporting relationship only to one boss, right? Meaning that in an organization, everybody in an organization reports primarily to one manager. So even if the person reports to several managers, there's one manager that is the person's direct supervisor, if that makes sense. That's what unity of command is all about, because that manager would be tasked or charged with the responsibility of developing performance targets for such an employee, would also be charged with tasked with the responsibility of appraising the performance of such an employee, as the case may be, or recommending such an employee for several things within the organization. It could be for promotions, it could be for capacity development, it could be for official trips, right? So there would be that one manager within that organization that employee actually reports to. That's what unity of command is all about. Now you have the other element of chain of command, which is the scalar principle, right? Basically suggests that there must be a clear and unbroken line of authority from the base of the organization to the top of the organization, right? Let's say, for instance, in Francis Marion University, let's assume that I am at the base of the university, which means I am a faculty member, right? A clear line of authority that is unbroken, which means that me at the base, there should be a clear line between me at the base and the president of Francis Marion University at the top. And that unbroken reporting line is such that from me, I report to, let's say, the dean of the School of Business. That is a clear reporting line. And from the dean of the School of Business, the dean of the School of Business reports to the provost, and the provost reports to the president. So you can see that there's a continuous line from my level at the base of the organization to the president, because of those reporting lines between me and the president that comprises both the dean and the provost. So that is related to scalar principle. Span of management. So there are different spans of management, right? You have the narrow span of management and the wide span of management. Span of management basically is the number of people who report to a particular manager, right? And managers in organizations, they deal with different kind of interactions. First would be the direct interaction, whereby it represents the one-on-one relationship between the manager and their subordinates, right? Now the cross interaction a manager also would be involved with would be such that subordinates that the manager supervises, the relationship they have among themselves. So the manager too may actually be involved, or may be may be part of such an interaction, because this is such relationship going on between two employees that such manager supervises, right? And you have the group interaction, right? Relationships between groups of subordinates, right? And there's some form of mathematical computation for like this the number of interactions a manager would have within an organization, right? So, and such computation, the formula would be I representing the interaction would be equal to n, which is the number of subordinates of such a manager, right? Multiplying n by the components in the bracket, which is 2, with an exponential value of n, divided by 2 in addition to n minus 1, right? So you find out that that would be the computation. So still on the narrow versus wide spans of management, some scholars made an attempt in describing these spans of management, right? And you find out that such a scholar like the Ralph Davis, right, had proposed that there are two spans. One would be the operative span, whereby a manager would have up to 30 subordinates that they supervise, right? And he says that this scholar was more of the opinion that such span of management would exist at the lower level of the organization, where you have like the first line managers, right? Because as you go up the hierarchy, you find out that the managers going higher up the hierarchy, the span will thin down, right? So this scholar is basically saying that at the first line managerial level, managers at that level have more subordinates, have more number of subordinates reporting to them, more than other managers within an organization, like the middle managers and the top managers, right? And also the executive span, which was proposed by this scholar says that an executive span would be limited to about 9 subordinates reporting to such a manager, and you find such executive span in the middle management level and the top management level. Also, other scholars basically furthered this study, or furthered this proposition, by saying that an executive span of management shouldn't exceed 6 subordinates rather than 9 subordinates earlier suggested. Tall versus flat organizations. Now, tall organizations is basically representative of organizations that have many layers of management, right? Several managerial hierarchy, like a lot of managerial levels in their managerial hierarchy, right? With a limited span of control, right? Such organizations are more expensive to actually operate or to administer, right? And there are communication problems in such tall organizations. So tall organizations may also be referred to as mechanistic organizations, or organizations that are hierarchical, given the number of managerial levels, numerous number of managerial levels that are existent within it. And you find out that more often than not, these tall organizations or mechanistic organizations have departments rather than business units, right? And they have more reporting lines because there are more number of managers, so you have a lot more reporting lines given the tall hierarchy of managers. Now you have the flat organizations that have a wider span of management because you have less managers in the hierarchy, right? So you find out that given the lower number of managers, they have more subordinates. That increases their span of management, right? So that's why it's a wider span of management. And it says that these flat structures, right, or flat organizations, they lead to higher levels of employee morale and productivity. So why is it the case? Because employees could actually move from job to job, given that a manager may be overseeing a lot of functions under their purview. So employees may not be bored over time because they could switch from jobs to job under the same manager, right? So there could be more boost in morale because they don't get bored over monotonous tasks, right? And there could be increased productivity, right? Because it means that for employees to be able to switch from job function to job function under the same manager, there wouldn't be a lacuna at any point. So even if one employee were to be away, it's easy for other employees under the same manager to take up other functions. You understand that weren't primarily their function. That actually enhances productivity, right? But the manager, given the large span of management, would have more administrative responsibility rather than managers in the mechanistic or tall organizations, right? So tall organizations basically, in summary, have more layers of management than the flat organizations, right? But many businesses like Francis Marion University have adopted a flatter organization by increasing their span of management. So like in the School of Business, rather than having departmental chairs, right, those were flattened out in the School of Business because the School of Business replicated the flat structure that exists at the organizational level. So basically, it's the practice that every faculty member in the School of Business actually reports to the dean directly, rather than having to report to a departmental chair that now reports to the dean. You see, having to report to a departmental chair before the dean will be a taller hierarchy because there's another layer of management, right? But having to have all faculty members just report to the dean, that is a flatter management structure, but it means that the dean would now have more administrative responsibility to having to oversee all those employees rather than just overseeing the faculty chairs that would report to him ordinarily, right? So having all the employees report to him rather than just faculty chairs that oversee other employees report to him, that would be a that will be a wider an enhanced administrative responsibility. The diagrams on this slide are representations of the tall and flat organizations, right? So for the tall, you can see one, two, three managerial levels between the president and the last line of employees, right? The the very base of the organization. So you can see three managerial levels in between. Whereas the flat organization, between the president and the base of the organization, there's only one managerial level. Factors influencing span of management. You have the competence of the supervisor and subordinates playing a role in how wide or thin the span of management is, right? So you find out that the greater the competence of the supervisor and the greater the competence of the subordinates, then the wider the potential span, right? So the greater equals wider when you're looking at the competence level of both the manager and the subordinate. So when they are both very efficient, when the manager and subordinates are both very capable in the job role or job function, then it provides for a wider span of management, right? Allowing for the manager to take on more employees because they have wider range of expertise, and you find out that too their administrative responsibilities would be limited because they wouldn't have to consistently oversee the activities of their subordinates because they are very reliant on the capabilities of their subordinates. So when the subordinates are very competent, when they are very capable to deliver on the job, the manager has less responsibility to actually micromanage or to actually supervise them because they are well convinced that those employees or their subordinates could actually take on those job responsibilities on their own and come out with very laudable outcomes, right? So that's about competence of supervisor and subordinates. Now, the physical dispersion of subordinates, how spread out are those subordinates, right? How are they stationed in different locations of the organization, right? So the greater the dispersion, the narrower the potential span. So I'll give an example where I used to work in when I used to work in the industry. We had zonal offices, right? Besides the headquarters of the organization. So you find out that having other employees be in zonal offices, that allowed for some management structure in the zones, right? So for every number of employees in the zone, which will be a smaller number of employee, right? You find out that for those locations there will be managers. So the dispersion creates for some form of narrowness in the span because that will be a smaller number of employee deployed to those locations, right? So you see that greater dispersion equals narrower span of management. Now, also another factor that actually affects or impacts the span of management would be the extent of non-supervisory work in the manager's job, right? So the more the non-supervisory work the manager has to engage in, the narrower the potential span of their management, the less number of subordinates they would have to supervise, right? Because I mean, non-supervisory work means more people to supervise, right? So the more non-supervisory work, right? The more the non-supervisory work, the more work that doesn't require overseeing what their subordinates is doing, the narrower their potential span, right? Does that make sense? Because they wouldn't have those subordinates they are actually having to manage or actually responsible for overseeing their performance, right? Now, also, the other factor will be the degree of required interaction that is expected in the relationship between the manager or supervisor and their subordinates. So when there is less need or less need for interaction between the manager and their subordinate, the likelihood there will be a wider span of management, right? The wider the potential span of management, because I mean, if the manager had to actually look into or interact with a lot more of employees, right? You find out that the manager might get burned out, right? So when the interaction is less, when the interaction, like the time allotted or the availability of the manager, or the situations that require the manager to be available to their subordinates, the less number of situations that requires the manager's attention for their subordinates to confer with them on what to do, then there's the likelihood to have a wider potential span of management, because the manager's administrative responsibilities will be less because they have less interactions with their subordinates. Further on the factors influencing span of management, you have the extent of standardized procedures, whereby the more procedures, the wider the potential span. So, for example, right, in a manufacturing company, for instance, in an assembly line, so you may have what you call the standard operating procedures, right? That actually ensures that the quality of the products are all the same. So you have to take the same steps in the production process, right? So to ensure that the outcomes are the same. So when those there are standard operating procedures, it may be on an assembly line, it might even be on a job role within an official setting, right? It could be steps to maybe addressing some employee complaint, let's say it's in the human resources, right? The more standardized procedures there are available for how a job function is to be executed, then the wider the potential span, because those steps means that the manager doesn't have to always oversee what their subordinates are doing. Those steps that are outlined or enumerated allows for subordinates to undertake the tasks with less supervision, meaning a manager could actually have a lot more subordinates that they oversee, because those subordinates could approach tasks on their own with less supervision, given the existence of a standard operating procedure. Now, another factor that impacts span of management will be the similarity of tasks being supervised, right? So, whereby a manager that is supervising similar tasks, right, could actually take on more number of subordinates, a wider potential span. So, let's say, for instance, in the organization I used to work for, right, there was something like the Human Capital and Infrastructure Group, for instance, right, that was headed by a director. So now the Capital and Infrastructure Group is just about the similarity of tasks, because the administrative department was part of the departments that composed this department, right? The administrative, the human capital department, and the information technology department. And you find out that why they are similar is because these three departments where their functions were always brought to bear whenever an employee was recruited within the organization. Does that make sense? Meaning that when human resources department recruits an employee, the administrative department ensures that the employee has the basic furniture, the office space that they would be in, and having the basic furniture to get their jobs done. And the IT department would be responsible for ensuring that they have the computer systems, that they are well connected on the network, they have login details, all those sorts, right, upon the entry of a new employee. So you find out that there is some form of similarity in tasks, which allows for one manager to oversee the functions of these several functions of an organization, allowing for more employees to be under their span of management, right? So the more the similarity of tasks, the wider the potential span. Another factor would be the frequency of new problems, right? So the higher the frequency, the narrower the potential span, meaning that for each time there are problems coming up, right, those subordinates who are faced with those problems on the job have the need to consult with their manager, right, have to confer with the manager. So for each time the manager's presence or the manager's availability or time is required, it means that there should be less number of subordinates, right? So the manager can actually supervise efficiently, can actually manage those employees under them more efficiently because of the frequency of problems. So that would impact the number of employees under their supervision. You understand? Now you have also another factor, which is the preferences of supervisors, right, and subordinates, right? So the preferences of supervisors, meaning that depending on how many subordinates a manager says that they are interested in taking on, that they can effectively manage, that would impact their span, right? A manager who basically expresses maybe to top management, a middle manager, that they are able to actually take up supervision of roles, an expanded number of functions, right? That's such a manager who has such preference may find themselves having a wider span versus also subordinates too. Their preferences also could actually impact or influence the span of management. Distributing authority, right? So authority or the delegation of power within an organization, right, would also be an important building block in structuring organizations, right? So it's about distribution of authority among the positions within an organization. Talk about authority. Authority, it would be the power that has been legitimized by the organization, right? And you find out that new positions that are availed or that are accorded some form of, or that have authority or power distributed to them, right? You will find out that as there are increased number of employees, there may be new managerial positions that will be established with an increasing organizational size, right? The organizational size, the increase in organizational size might be by virtue of the increased number of employees, or might be by virtue of increased number of customers. So most often than not, when there are increased number of employees, that there's the likelihood that there would be the establishment of new managerial positions, right? And those would require giving them some form of power that is legitimized, right, for them to carry out their managerial duties. Also, there's this other concept called delegation, whereby the managers assign work or to their subordinates. So delegation will be for all the responsibilities or tasks a manager is saddled with, right? They're able to break down those tasks into simpler components that can actually be assigned to their subordinates, right? Which that all those little elements that are taken care of by the subordinates, they can all be collated by the manager to actually deliver on the holistic task. So that would be delegation, the breaking down of the manager's task into simpler tasks to be assigned to their subordinates. The delegation process. Delegation. The main reason for delegation within an organization is to actually avail the managers time to get more work done, right? There are other reasons for delegation, and you find out that some of those reasons will be a situation where the employee or the subordinate may have more expertise than the manager, right? It could be a manager, for instance, who just got newly deployed to that department, for instance, and there are employees that have been part of that department over time, that are very functional staff or functional employees of that department over time. Now, in the event that the manager wouldn't have sufficient time to consult to get some jobs done, they can easily assign jobs that those employees within the department that are functional employees have very very that are have very well and have well enhanced expertise in, right, that their expertise is such that the manager's level of competence doesn't measure up to how much they know with regards to that particular task, right? So based on that, the manager could actually delegate to such employees, or the manager may want to challenge and develop employee skills. So another reason for delegation would be assigning those challenging tasks to the subordinates, and in delivery of those tasks, when they deliver it sufficiently, that improves on the skill of the employee, right, subsequently, right? Or in trying to get the task done, they may always come and get some feedback or come and confer with the manager, which along the line they develop the skills or the requisite skills to get such tasks done. So delegation may be a way managers actually up the skills of their subordinates or employees. Now, the delegation process actually involves three steps. The first would be when the manager assigns the responsibility or task to the employee or subordinate, right? And you find out that the second step would actually include the manager actually giving authority, right, or autonomy to the employee or to the subordinate that allows them to approach those job tasks or job responsibilities as they deem fit, right? And the third phase of the process of delegation would be the accountability established by the manager. And the accountability is such that when the manager assigns the job to the subordinate, the onus lies on the subordinate to always provide the manager with feedback with regards to how the job is being done, how much progress is being done on the job, right? So the subordinates should be very accountable, given that they've been given autonomy over the outcome of such job function, right? So they should be accountable for the outcomes, and also the manager who assigned those tasks are ultimately accountable for the outcome. So you find out that there's always the need for that subordinate who has been assigned the task to always give the manager feedback, for the manager to ensure that the job is progressive, right? It's progressing in the right direction, because ultimately the manager would be accountable for the outcomes of that job. Now, problems also may arise when managers are unwilling or unable to delegate, right? So those managers may be unwilling to delegate or unable. The inability to delegate may be born out of the managers not being very organized, right, to delegate, right? And the unwillingness to delegate to subordinates might just be that they do not trust their employees enough, or they are not confident in the capabilities of their employees, right? Another thing that may actually create problems in the delegation process or with delegation would be the reluctance of those employees that are assigned tasks, the reluctance or their unwillingness to take on those tasks. The diagram on this slide is just an enumeration of the steps in the delegation process, right? We already discussed that in the previous slide. Decentralization and centralization, right? These all relate to the delegation of power, the delegation of authority within an organization, right? Decentralization is about delegating power and authority throughout the organization to middle and first line managers from the top managers. So such powers are cascaded down the hierarchy of the organization. While decentralization is on one end of the continuum, on the other end of the continuum is what's called centralization, right? So, like we said, decentralization is all about the systematic delegation of power and authority to lower level managers, while centralization is about the retention of power and authority at the top level of the organization, right? So the things or the elements that actually determine what approach to delegation of power organizations take up or actually undertake would be: one, what is the external environmental situation like? What's the complexity? How much complexity exists both within the environment, within the organizational environment, or even outside the environment, and what uncertainties exist? Now, what is the history of the organization, right, over time? The riskiness of the decision would actually determine if power or authority should be concentrated at the top or cascaded down the hierarchy, right? So when the decisions are very risky, then there may be likelihood, if they have financial implications, then there's likelihood that the power may be retained at the top level, right? And when managers, lower level managers or first line managers or maybe middle managers are quite competent, you find out that most often than not, power or authority may be cascaded down the hierarchy down to these managers because of their levels of competence, right? So we find out that that's the case. So for external environment of the organization, that has to do with complexity and uncertainty, right? And complexity and uncertainty within the external environment, for instance, it makes organizations to decentralize, right? So why they would decentralize is because at that lower level, if they have the power or autonomy, they can respond more quickly to the environmental needs, right? Or to the needs from the external environment, rather than having to pass on those needs up the hierarchy. That would cause for bureaucracy. So when the external environment is more complex or there's a lot of uncertainty, then the organization most often than not, or is the ideal situation should be to delegate power down the hierarchy, right? Another factor, the history of the organization. So organizations tend to do what they have done in the past, right? So if organizations have been used to retaining power at the top or used to cascading power down the hierarchy, then more often than not they would want to still continue with that, right? And when the decision, like we said, is riskier or costlier, right, there's the pressure to centralize power, right? So if it's some decision that has a lot of financial implications, like we talked about, right, organizations wouldn't want to jeopardize that and have that handled by maybe middle and lower level managers, right? So also the abilities of lower level managers, like we said, so when they don't have much capabilities, right, then decisions may be centralized at the top. But when they are very competent, then it could be cascaded down. Coordinating activities. Coordination of activities within an organization would be like the fifth building block of an organization, right? Because the fifth major element of organizing will be coordination. Now, as much as those building blocks earlier discussed, like the job specialization and departmentalization, right? As much as they break down jobs of an organization into smaller units and probably compose them into departments, right? You find out that coordination actually keeps the departmental activities focused on the organizational goals, right? Coordination is about how the various departments within the organization, how they interact, what interaction they have among those departments, which ensures that the organizational goals or objectives are achieved at the upper level, right? So it could happen in various ways, right? So coordination is the process of basically linking the activities of various departments in the organization. And it comes in three forms, right? The first would be the pooled interdependence. This would be basically when different departments of the organization actually operate, or the different business units of an organization operate with little interaction, right? But what happens is all their outputs, right, all the outcomes of those various departments are pulled at the corporate level or at the top level or at the organizational level, right? That's about pooled interdependence. Now you have the sequential interdependence, whereby the output of one department or one business unit becomes the input for another department or a business unit in a sequential fashion, right? That would be sequential interdependence. And the third on the list would be the reciprocal interdependence, when activities of departments flow in both ways, right? How do I mean? So let me go back to the sequential interdependence and give you an example, for instance. So for instance, when we talked about the human capital and infrastructure group as a department comprising both HR, admin, and IT departments, sequential interdependence would be like the relationship between human capital department or HR department and the administrative department with regards to the recruitment of new employees, whereby as the HR department recruits new employees, right, the output, which is having recruited, right, they pass on the output of their job function, which is new employees, they pass it on to the admin department that now takes it up. Having identified that there are new employees that were done by the function of the HR, they go ahead and undertake their function, which is providing office space for the new employees, providing them furniture and other working tools, right? So you see, HR's output becomes administration department's input in this case. Now, the reciprocal interdependence, whereby activities of different departments flow both ways, you can relate that to the relationship between the finance departments of an organization and the audit department of an organization, whereby the payment need, or whatever employee payments that are required, or whatever payments that are done within the organization, right? When the finance department raise vouchers for such payments, for instance, the internal audit department gets to vet it. So the finance department raises vouchers, for instance, and sends to the audit department to confirm and validate that whatever the finance department has raised is in tandem with the policies or financial policies of the organization and maybe the environment in which the organization operates. That's basically what the internal audit department would do. And after doing that, they send back such documents to the finance department for payment, right? So you find out that those activities flow both ways. Finance output will becomes audit input and vice versa, whereby internal audit input becomes finances, internal audit output becomes finances input. Now, why is there the need for coordination within organizations? You find out that the primary reason for coordination is that departments and work groups need information and resources from each other, right? To do whatever their jobs are within an organization. Because an organization, whatever departments that exist there, all tied to the delivery of the organizational objectives, we find out that most often than not, all those different departments within the organization would have need for both information and resources amongst themselves, right? So that would be it about coordination. Structural coordination techniques. So you find out that structural coordination techniques would include, one would be the managerial hierarchy. You see that most often than not in tall organizations, or what you call the mechanistic organizations, right? What it does, how this coordination happens is, coordination here, you place one manager in charge of interdependent departments or units, right? So basically, like for instance, when I mentioned that the human capital and infrastructure group where I used to work in the industry comprised the human resources, the administration, and the IT department, because all those departments, right, are interdependent, given, let's say, the how they relate with regards to the employment with new employments, right? Because of that, having to put one manager in charge of the human capital and infrastructure group, this allows for better coordination between these departments that are interdependent, right? Or let's say, for instance, because the finance and internal audit departments are quite interdependent, right? Having to create some form of department with one manager that oversees these two departmental activities would be the managerial hierarchy, kind of. So managerial hierarchy is most effective as a coordination technique when the organization is relatively tall and centralized, right? When it is mechanistic most often than not, and having power retained at the top level, right? So you have another technique called the rules and procedures, right? This has to do with coordinating routine activities. It may not be relevant or impactful for coordinating complex problems, right? It may not be useful for complex problems. So you have also managers in liaison roles, right? So managers in liaison roles would coordinate interdependent departments or units, right, by basically acting as a common point of contact, right, in order to actually facilitate for flow of information between the departments, these interdependent departments or units, right? And we have the task forces, right? They work well when interdependence of departments is quite complex, right? So they work well especially when there are more than two departments, several departments or business units interacting, right? And you find out that individuals from each of these departments or each of these business units has special information, right? And or brings some form of expertise on board when they join this task force, right? Because the task force basically may be constituted to solving a problem, right? Solving a problem that probably cuts across different departments or business units of an organization. Therefore, to allow for ease in coordination, a task force may be constituted, and members of these different departments of the organization, different members from these departments actually compose the task force, right, to bring their expertises to bear to solve a common problem that relates to their various departments, right? So constituting a task force may be a structural coordination technique an organization may adopt in the event that some problem that has to be addressed cuts across different departments. Now you have the technique called integrating departments, right? This will be basically to collapse them more. This is a more permanent version of a task force whereby collaborating departments, rather than have employees from these departments come together as a task force, basically would be collapsing departments as one. Does that make sense? So there are permanent members as well as temporary members when such is done. The greater the degree of interdependence, the more attention the organization devote to coordination, right? So where the input of different departments is increased, right, then there is higher need for coordination of their activities, if that makes sense. Now you have what you call the digital coordination, or technology having to enable coordination, right? So we find out that technology like the internet or email or even the handheld mobile devices we have, or even computers that are on an organizational network, they actually create for ease in coordination. Differentiating between positions. Now, the differentiation between positions within an organization would be the last building block of an organization structure, right? Having to differentiate between the line and staff positions. We'll understand what that means, right? A line position basically would be the direction of command that is responsible for the achievement of the organization's goals or objectives, right? When we say reporting line, right? The line position whereby a subordinate reporting to a manager, that's a line position. Up, down reporting, right? You understand? That's a line position, direct chain of command, direct chain of authority, right? From subordinate reporting along the line to a manager. Now you have what you call a staff position, right? Staff position provides expertise, right? Advice and support for the line positions, right? What is the difference between a line position and a staff position? Their purpose differs, right? Line managers work towards organizational goals, achieving organizational goals. That's why basically when they are setting performance targets for their subordinates, they are doing so in tandem with what the organizational goals are, right? But staff managers basically assist and advise, right? They are not tasked with basically getting the organizational goals achieved. They are more of an advisory capacity, right? Now, also authority differs between these different managers. The line authority is formal or legitimate authority, right? Because these are recognized or legitimized by the organization, right? Whereas staff authority is less concrete and may take many forms, right? Advice authority, which is staff authority, maybe advice authority, means the line manager can choose whether to seek or avoid input from staff, right? If a line manager is in advisory capacity, right? So advice authority, let's say when you're talking about authority, advice authority relates more to the line manager choosing whether to seek input from their subordinate, right, or avoid input from their subordinate. Whereas compulsory advice, for instance, when it comes to authority, means the line manager must consider the advice but can choose to heed or ignore it, meaning that they would always get input, right? But after getting input from their staff, they may choose to actually implement those advice or ignore it, right? Now, there's another concept called functional authority, right? And this may be considered the most important form of authority. This is formal or legitimate authority over activities related to the staff member's specialty, right? So that is formal authority, functional authority. So the powers that are allocated to a particular job function of an organization, most like a managerial job function of an organization.